Good morning, Professor John.
Good morning, sir.
Would you say the words of the affirmation after me, please? I
Indeed.
solemnly, sincerely, and truly
I solemnly, sincerely, and truly
declare and affirm
declare and affirm
that I will tell the truth,
that I will tell the truth,
the whole truth,
and
nothing but the truth.
and nothing but the truth.
Miss Graham.
Good morning.
Good morning.
You are Augustine John, known as Gus.
That's right.
What age are you?
I was born in 1945.
And am I right in saying you are a professor of education and social policy?
Yes.
And I see from the details that you've sent to the inquiry that you were a visiting professor of education at Strathclyde University through in the West Coast between 1997 and 2007.
That's correct.
And am I correct in saying you've been writing about race and policing and conducting social research since the late 1960s?
That's correct.
And you've been delivering training for over 50 years.
Yes.
And that is training on race and discrimination and matters of that sort.
And government policy, yes.
Government policy. And really, since the 60s, you started, I think, as a youth worker in areas like London and metropolitan cities, and you've also been a youth leader, and you've run youth clubs again since the 1960s.
That's correct.
So is it fair to say that throughout your entire career and for the majority of your life, you've been working in these areas of education, race, discrimination, equality, government policy, education?
That's right.
Thank you. And I know that you've kindly, for the inquiry, watched some of the evidence that we've taken from other witnesses. And it will come as no surprise that you have a blue folder in front of you on the desk, and we've given you a hard copy of anything we think may assist you. You may also have noticed that the screen in front of you, and you may have seen that when I'm taking witnesses through statements and such like, I'll usually ask for that to be brought up on the screen, and that then allows everyone in the room to follow what we're talking about.
Sure.
If you prefer the hard copy, you have that in front of you. And then I'll probably read it and then ask you some questions, and we'll follow that process today.
Thank
you.
you.
Are you happy with that?
Absolutely.
Thank you. And having read through your statement, Professor, I think you say that initially the inquiry team were in touch with you and at one point thought they would get you to prepare a report. But after some discussion and after a period of time, I think it was agreed that you would prepare a witness statement, and you should have a hard copy of that in front of you. And I'd like to look at that witness statement, if I may. It's SBPI 00689. And you see that's come up on the screen. And it's an expert witness statement, Professor Augustine John. And it was taken by the team on the 22nd of August and the 4th of September this year.
That's right.
Now, this document, which we have on the screen, is 100 pages. And if we could look at the final paragraph of the actual statement part, which is on page 91, and you'll see the final paragraph is 238. There we are. And it ends, I believe the facts stated in this witness statement are true. I understand that this statement may form part of the evidence before the inquiry and be published on the inquiry's website.
Yes.
And although this version is redacted on the screen, we can see that you apparently signed it on the 11th of September of this year.
That's right.
And your hard copy will show you your signature, and you'll have signed that on every page. And you knew that when you were signing this statement that it was for the benefit of the chair, and
Yes.
that you were doing your best to be accurate and truthful in the course of this statement.
Yes.
Thank you. Now, there's two things I believe you wish to correct. Now, the first is in paragraph 187 of the statement. And that starts on page 69. At the bottom of page 69. And it's 187. And this is where you talk about when the 10 legacy organisations formed Police Scotland in 2013, they ought to have been compliant with the public sector equality duty since the Equality Act 2010 came into force, and before that with the race equality duty. And then it goes on to say, I have seen evidence provided to this inquiry from witnesses involved in the transition period. This was clearly a challenging project, and it was understandable that the objective was to make the transition as seamless as possible. That was a strategic priority, but one that need have displaced other interlocking strategic priorities. And the word "not" is missing from that sentence. So it should say, that was a strategic priority, but maybe not one that need to have displaced, but one that need not have displaced other strategic priorities.
It should be need not have displaced. That's
Need
correct.
not.
Yes.
So it should read, but one that need not have displaced other interlocking strategic priorities.
That's correct.
And so the chair can take that into account when he's reading that paragraph in the future. And then the other issue that I want to raise at the outset relates to an addendum to your inquiry statement, and it's SBPI 00703. And this has been prepared as an addendum to your statement, again from September of this year, and it's a correction to your statement. And if we go down, we can see that you had been provided with a document relating to training by the inquiry team, and the inquiry team then discovered they'd sent you the wrong document.
That's correct.
So you had looked at that training document on the assumption that it related to training in or around 2014-2015, but that then was later explained that had been sent in error.
Yes.
So this addendum simply looks at what you did have and corrects the error that was due to the inquiry.
That's right.
Mistakenly sending you that document. And we can come back to that later today. Thank you. First of all, I'd like to look at what forms Appendix A of your statement, which is page 92. And you were asked about your career, and this is a career summary. And we've touched on some of those matters. In summary, I've conducted social research and written about race and policing since the late 1960s. We've already discussed that. Could we look at 243, please? I've been delivering training on race and discrimination for the last half a century to the police, the CPS, the Crown Prosecution Service, social workers, probation officers, careers officers, trainee teachers, school, college and university managers, business leaders, local authority officers and civil servants. I've delivered management development courses for local authorities, which opted to adopt positive action measures and invest in the development of black and global majority staff within their own workforce in order to ensure a better representation of black staff in senior managerial positions.
Yes.
So tell us a little about some of the work that you've been doing on training.
One of the neglected areas, I think, in leadership and management training, and indeed in the training of people such as social workers, careers officers, etc., is to couple race and race relations, so to speak, with the particular careers that those folk are entering. In other words, you can have generic training on any one of those subjects, social work, teaching, whatever, without that being seen as, without an understanding of race and racial politics in Britain being seen as an integral part of that. Many years ago, I used to be asked by what were then polytechnics and indeed universities, those who trained teachers, for example, to go and do some training on multicultural education, on race and education, on urban education. And those sessions were invariably in the final term of a 3-year course for 1 day. If you were lucky, 1 week. So those folk would have gone through 3 years of training about everything else. And then in that 1 day, I was expected to force feed them on issues to do with race, so they could have an understanding of how to conduct themselves in a classroom with white children only, or a classroom with a mixed student population of Caribbean people, people from South Asia, Chinese people, or whatever. And frankly, that was just ridiculous. It wasn't only tokenistic, but it did not do those being trained any good. It was not advantageous. Imagine if you were born in Cooper, let's say, or Glen Rothes, and you go to school, primary school, secondary school, in those areas, which typically do not include integrally issues of race, Scotland's engagement with colonialism and imperialism or what have you. And the only references there are to black people, people of other ethnicities, is in relation to immigration, and immigration as racialized. In other words, dealing with race as a problem. Your understanding of who your neighbors might be tomorrow, or even concurrently, would be very, very limited, and you would begin to see them in terms of being extra, othered, not quite belonging, not in a normal situation, because a normal situation would be to be white Scottish. So unless those matters are actually addressed, you then go into a classroom where you're having to teach children from Pakistan, India, China, Caribbean, whatever, and there are no reference points. You can't begin to relate to them in a manner which says, I understand what your presence here means. I understand how people like you come to be in Scotland. I understand that the curriculum I'm going to deliver does not naturally include you, and the systems of knowledge production that the groups to which you belong or the countries from which you come have been doing for centuries. So when I say it puts those being trained at a disadvantage, what I'm saying is that 3 years of training or 4 years on an honors course fails to equip them with the knowledge, the understanding, the aptitudes, the skills to deal with a multi-ethnic or multiracial classroom. But more than that, those skills are necessary even if there are no children whatsoever from other ethnicities in the classroom. They're necessary for a school anywhere in Scotland, or England for that matter, with no black kids whatsoever. Because our histories are intertwined, they're interconnected. And so the interface between Britain, the British Isles, and those countries from which people like me come has to be understood. Because a failure to do that is a failure to begin to address those imbalances and what I call erasures, the erasure of the knowledge that's produced within those places. I keep saying to people, when Wole Soyinka, that giant of a writer, a literature expert from Nigeria, or Derek Walcott from St. Lucia, got the Nobel Peace Prize for literature, it wasn't because the Nobel Committee decided that it was time to add some color to the business. They were people who were excellent in their particular disciplines. But yet, there are many schools, and indeed universities, who have a view of a canon of English literature that does not include literature in English. And people like my children who go to those places to do English literature, drama, whatever else, are treated to a curriculum which bears no relationship whatsoever to the work of people like them, or Maya Angelou, or Toni Morrison, or any of those others I could name. And that is how the country continues to bump along, continuing to treat people like me as other, and seeing as normal a literature and epistemology that doesn't begin to take account of anything else but Western systems of knowledge production and the products of that system.
Thank you. I intend to come back to this matter. You've addressed it in your statement, so we will come back to it. Is it fair to summarise, if I may, your position that training is not just about what the trainers are delivering to the students, but there has to be consideration of the trainers themselves, their background, how they've been brought up, their own understanding of their place in the world. Because without looking at the trainers, it's a very limited approach to training. Is it fair to say that?
Absolutely.
Thank you. Right. We will come back to that in more detail when we look through your statement. Can we look at paragraph 4 of your statement, please? And here you say the principles for effective training and cultural change, which I will go on to discuss in this statement, are a distillation of years of experience of training and guidance on training programmes in a wide range of institutions. They are transferable to any organisation. It's a template that organisations should use and is applicable to police services, prosecuting authorities and commissioners such as PERC. And so if someone looked at your CV and suggested, oh, you've never delivered a training course specifically to PERC, the commissioner, Do you consider in any way that that criticism would hinder you from expressing views about training, good quality training, and the evidence that you'll be giving to help the chair today?
No, I certainly do not. It would be ridiculous to suggest that one cannot infer from what an organization does the extent to which those doing have got the skills or the understanding or the knowledge to bring to whatever situations they might encounter. If someone is not conscious of the context in which, for example, racial discrimination occurs, whether it be in terms of verbal harassment, physical attacks, discrimination in one form or another, then they're likely to take for granted or consider to be normal or not so important matters or actions which other people, black people, for example, experience as very damaging. To take a particular example, that's the difference between seeing racial slurs and the indulgence in casual racism as banter, as distinct from matters that injure other people's feelings, make them feel inadequate, not quite belonging, or whatever else. And there are power relationships involved in all of that. So somebody might feel capable of using words, expressions, certain actions, and seeing that as banter because they belong to a group of people who have the power to determine that, as distinct from those who suffer discrimination on a day-to-day basis and experience that banter as discrimination. So well, as somebody who's been doing this business for 60 years or whatever, it would be ridiculous to suggest that one cannot bring a framework of understanding and apply a certain number of principles to what an organization does to be able to critique that and see how good it is or how deficient it is.
And as I understand your statement, you're trying to draw forth some of those fundamental principles. And your view is that they are transferable. It doesn't matter what organization you're talking about.
Yes, I mean, I do quite a lot of work around leadership and management. And my assessment would be that on the whole, leadership and management in this country is pretty woeful when it comes to an understanding of matters to do with race. And for the life of me, I cannot understand why after all of these years, let's say going back to 1950, for example, with colleges, universities churning out so many people who become leaders and managers, we still have a situation where senior management, which is typically white in this society, are so bereft in terms of their understanding of those sorts of issues. Individuals don't take responsibility to educate themselves and to develop the knowledge and the skills that are necessary. And those who train them don't consider it important enough to ensure that they have that kind of training. And the whole gamut, it goes all around. I mean, I have been involved in issues to do with the law for God knows how long. And I can say personally that I and people like me, wearing academic hats and political activism hats, have contributed significantly to the knowledge that lawyers have about these matters. I used to represent, as a youth worker, young people in the juvenile court practically every day of the week. And sometimes I was there to represent them and give character reference or be an actual witness to events that may have occurred, where the police were very much at fault. Now, it took some while before lawyers began to understand that these were the realities in terms of the interaction between young black people and the police. So that they should not automatically, whether they were duty solicitors or not, believe that you get rid of the matter by getting the person to plead guilty to something that they had not done, because you believe that if they went in front of a bench, the magistrate or the magistrates or the judge would sooner believe the police rather than themselves. And that was a massive learning curve for the criminal justice system. But those changes wouldn't have come about but for the persistence of people like myself, who was not only a youth worker but trained youth workers, so that the police the solicitors got a better understanding of the process of criminalization of young black people, and how that needed to be dealt with, so that they were not themselves being seen as part of a criminal injustice system.
Thank you. You've talked about activism. Could we look at paragraph 241 of your inquiry? This is part of Appendix A. It's on page 92. And you've mentioned there one of the books that you've written, which was called Deaths in Custody. And you say, as a policing and racial justice issue, I've been involved directly or indirectly with campaigning and supporting bereaved families. And is that also an aspect of your life over many years, that you've also supported bereaved families and been involved in campaigning?
Yes, it has been.
And has that given your work a particular perspective? Has it detracted in any way from your training work or enhanced it?
It has enhanced it, and that for a number of reasons. I think it's difficult for institutions such as the police that have got a mix of things going on. There are officers who are honorable, competent, proficient, human, and they go about their business reflecting all of those qualities and the values that go with them. There are others who choose to join the police because they know that in that uniform, they could indulge in all sorts of prejudicial and wrongful behavior. Some people in this room would be old enough to remember the 2020, no, not 2020, it was 2003, the Secret Policeman documentary that the BBC screened, where a journalist had had posed as a trainee a police officer, had been accepted for training and experienced the worst forms of racism amongst recruits like himself. And he documented all of that. The BBC edited it all, and they screened that program. Incidentally, it was screened on the same day that I was with Lord Peter Goldsmith, the then Attorney General, the Solicitor General, and others, presenting my research report for the Crown Prosecution Service, which I called Race for Justice. Same day. And that Secret Policeman documentary was actually giving evidence of why certain people, certain of those recruits, had joined the police on their own admission, and what they were going to do when they had passed and gone into their street patrols and the rest of it. It was shocking. And that documentary led to major changes in recruiting police officers. The point I'm making is that we need to understand that unless all of these processes are scrutinized, and unless the right questions are asked, the right procedures are applied, one can end up with a situation where people are able to go out there and be very prejudiced in their treatment of black people, people with disabilities, travelers and gypsies, and so on. So at the base of it all is an understanding that these discriminatory practices do occur within society, that goodness was not made in police colleges, and therefore the assumption that everybody sitting in a room being taught has got the right attitudes, the right values, does not subscribe to the beliefs of the National Front or right-wing groups. You've got to test all of that stuff. And evidence that we have of all sorts of malfunctions and malfeasance and bad practices within police forces up and down the country should be garnered so that one then determines how to address those sorts of issues, whether you'd be professional standards or supervisors of teams of police officers or whatever else.
So is it fair to say, Professor, that you would recommend to the chair that he not take too narrow a view of training recruits or otherwise, that it's a much broader issue about recruiting the right recruits, training them effectively, looking at their background, making sure they understand race relations, so that when they move on and get experience in the field, in the operational duties, and when they become trainers themselves, that they can share what is good practice because they've started with the right attitudes and values.
That is essential. And as I think I say in my statement, it's also important to understand that training and staff development, continuous professional development, does not occur in classrooms, or only in classrooms. You might take any group of people to Tully Allen for a day or a week or whatever, and you keep them focused in that space on whatever your training objectives might be. But if you have no way of understanding how that training is applied once they receive it, what difference it makes to them in terms of their value judgments, in terms of the way they exercise judgment in particular situations. Some of those situations very stressful. If none of that is interrogated through general routine organic processes such as supervision, staff appraisal, or whatever else it may be, then frankly, the training could be pretty gratuitous. You might be able to tick a box and say, yes, this person came on this officer safety training, so we know that they've been trained. But the fact that they attended doesn't really tell you anything. So training by itself could be a panacea, and it can still allow all sorts of ills to thrive within an organization if you don't take steps to ensure that it is totally integrated into general purpose, actual practice, and ways of assessing people's conduct and their understanding of their role.
So it's essential that those being trained can see how that has practical application when they go out the door of the training
Sure.
room and start doing their job. And that would apply whether they're police officers, staff with PERC, or the Crown Office.
Yes.
That there has to be that practical application that has to be made clear. And also that their comprehension, their conduct is assessed
Yes.
thereafter. And it's not just simply one day in an office being trained a particular topic and then never looked at again.
I mean, I can't stress that enough. In the documents that I was sent in preparing this statement, and indeed in the evidence that you've heard over the months, time and again, it is averred that a day's training, 2 days training, or whatever is not sufficient. And that is correct. It isn't sufficient. But the fact that it is only 2 days training, whether it be of probationers or anybody else, places a greater onus on the organization to ensure that it is continuous. And there's a thread running through what everybody does. So if one were to put training in brackets and rather introduce the notion of learning and learning development, a learning application, and see that as some kind of a matrix, then you begin to get to the heart of the matter. Why after the day or 2 days training or whatever, people still feel they can't go into a situation and make the right sort of judgment. And one knows instantaneously officers are called upon to make those sorts of judgments. You could be walking down the street on patrol or not, or you could be driving your police car, and by virtue of everybody seeing you visibly as police officers, they can target you and say, something is going on here, we want your intervention. You must be able to make quick and sound judgments in those kinds of situations. Now, you can't be expected to retain in your head whatever you might have learned at Tully Allen over a 3-day period, whether it be in terms of human rights legislation, in terms of risk assessment or threats or whatever else it may be. That's not how human beings work. You can't be expected to compute all of that instantaneously. So therefore, the issue of what is it you're making of that training? And how are you personally applying it to yourself in terms of your general day-to-day practice? That's the crucial thing. And you need to be assisted in doing that. And you're assisted in doing it by the kind of supervision that you get, by the sorts of questions people ask you about your practice, by your own setting your own targets for self-development and discussing those with whoever is supervising you or whatever, and being guided and supported in whatever difficulties you may be having in relation to those matters.
We've heard evidence that from all the officers who attended in Hayfield Road in May 2015, and some of them recalled receiving training in equality and diversity when they were probationers at Tullyallen, and some of them were further from that probation period than others. We've heard evidence from many officers who talked about attending a 2-day diversity course. But the chair's heard a lot of evidence because many officers were asked what they recollected of that training, and I'm confident to say the majority had very little recollection. Is that the type of situation that can arise if there is not that ongoing training that has practical application on a day-to-day basis?
Certainly. And especially in addition to that, if people are not within a culture that not only values learning, but puts a premium on people taking responsibility for their own learning and development. You need to do that. Okay. Police officers typically don't have a lot of time for stuff, but it seems to me you don't only begin to apply yourself when you want to go through whatever assessment or grading or whatever is necessary for you to become a sergeant or to become a superintendent or whatever. That's not the only time when you begin to cram. You need to, especially in relation to matters such as equality and diversity and what have you, you need to take responsibility for informing yourself. And knowing the law as given is one thing, but also a whole number of other matters. Why did the government choose, wrongly in my view, to pull all of these strands of legislation into one Equality Act? Race and disability and gender and whatever. What did the race discrimination legislation before then say or require? What did the 1975 Sex Discrimination Act require of public bodies? How did the Disability Act of 1995 come about? And what does it say about the way in which disabled people are treated within society? And how does that impact upon me as a police officer when I've got to deal with disability discrimination and so on? It's a matter of taking personal responsibility for those things.
Thank you. There's two aspects of the work you've done on training that I would like to draw to the chair's attention, if I may. Could we look at paragraph 250 on page 95, which is still part of Appendix A? And I think you've given the chair some information at 250 about how you were commissioned by the Home Office to evaluate training being delivered to the 43 police forces in England. This was in 2002. As a requirement of the Home Secretary in implementation of recommendations of the Stephen Lawrence Inquiry. My report, Quality Assurance of Community and Race Relations Training, was published by the Home Office in October 2003. Could you tell the chair a little bit more about that?
Okay, so post McPherson, Jack Straw was Home Secretary, and from 1997, when Labour came out of the wilderness after Thatcher and won the election, I was one of a group of people who formed the Race Relations Forum to advise Jack Straw. And in that capacity, worked with civil servants on the Race Relations Amendment Act. Jack Straw determined that given the findings and recommendations of Lord Macpherson, it was important that every police force received race relations training. A company called Ionan won the contract to deliver this training and recruited teams of people to go and train in each police service area. I was called in towards the end of that period to do an evaluation of that training. And that involved going into training settings, sitting at the back of the room, whatever, clearly not unseen, and witnessing what happened, who was delivering the training, who the trainees were, what was the content being delivered, what were the modes of delivery, how interactive it was, whether people were encouraged to bring their own experiences and put that up for scrutiny, et cetera, et cetera. And then what kind of evaluation procedures were used to evaluate how the training was being received. So there was a whole raft of stuff that I and the team of people I had with me were looking at. For me, it was a pretty searing experience. And I was shocked at the conduct, I have to say, in most cases of the police officers present. So the training was mandatory. Loads of people came to it pretty truculently. They didn't want to be there. They resented the fact that they were being made to be there and were coming out with some pretty pejorative stuff, so that the trainers, and many of them were not only black, but black women, were treated in the most disgraceful manner by these police trainees of different grades. And being made to account as trainers for whatever tropes the police officers had in their heads. And they were constantly being asked, why do you people always want this or that? What makes you lot so different? Why should the system bend to accommodate you, and so on? So in other words, people were using those sessions as an opportunity to vent their prejudices, to obstruct the trainer in terms of what they were seeking to deliver, and to try and whip up support for their negative attitudes and conduct from amongst their colleagues. Pretty shocking stuff, I found. And I thought to myself, well, if that is how, in a situation, knowing the background to this training, knowing that it arose out of a recommendation of McPherson and what the McPherson report inquiry actually found, why should you as a police officer come into that arena and demonstrate not only that McPherson and his team were right in what they found, but that it would take a miracle for you lot to be reformed sufficiently according to what the recommendations of the McPherson report had as their objective. What was even worse was that, having observed all of that, I then determined to ask the Association of Chief Police Officers for a meeting and to discuss with chief constables and borough commanders and those people what my experience of that was and how concerning it was. And there I discovered that there were no mechanisms within individual forces for people to do what I suggested in earlier answers to you, to see what the impact of that training was on those who attended, especially given the fact that many of them didn't want to attend in the first place, how that training was going to be followed up within the force. What impact was it going to have on the way in which those police officers were trained ordinarily, whether it be officer safety training, firearms training, or whatever else it may be? Which is why I said to the Home Office that the whole thing was a rather expensive exercise in dipping sheep.
And so once that training had been completed, even with the concerns you had about the training and the way it was approached by those being taught, that there were no mechanisms thereafter to consider impact, monitoring, see what difference it made to their operational work. Nothing like that put in place at all.
Okay. In some forces, individual officers, individual managers took this pretty seriously and actually asked for sessions with me so that they could be guided as to what they might do within the force in relation to the sorts of experiences I had had. And that was pretty productive. In other situations, senior managers were less engaged and frankly less interested. And I found that concerning. I had to take up one particular situation where an officer who clearly was very well regarded by the communities in which he worked wanted to be given responsibility for community liaison. And his superintendent pulled him aside and gave him some careers advice, which was police community relations is a graveyard. You're a very competent officer, you're liked by communities, and you've made a tremendous difference in terms of the development of trust and confidence within this particular area, given the relationship that there had been between the police and the community. But I have to warn you, if you want to go forward in your career and rise up the ranks, just slow down on this business. your enthusiasm is going to take you in quite the wrong direction, straight into the graveyard. Now, I mean, that speaks for itself. This person was confused, disappointed, and couldn't understand why, in spite of Macpherson, there was not a greater appetite within the senior leadership of his force to use the recommendations and findings of Macpherson to make a difference in terms of how the police are seen by the communities that they were serving.
Thank you. Can I move on to one other specific area I'd like to ask you about, and that's at paragraph 249, which is the one above. And here you say, in the early 2000s, I was commissioned by the Crown Prosecution Service to conduct research as to how prosecutors made decisions at the case review stage regarding cases involving race and gender, including racially aggravated offences. I chose 1,500 closed cases from each of the 10 CPS areas for my team and me to study. I was alarmed by the repeated pattern of defence lawyers and CPS engaging in plea bargaining and making deals which have all involved prosecutors agreeing to drop the racially aggravated component of the offending. I gathered the evidence and presented it to the Attorney General, Peter Goldsmith QC, who issued instructions preventing prosecutors from reaching deals, which meant that the racially aggravated aspect of offending could be dropped. Racially or religiously aggravated offences attracted stiffer sentences. I delivered training at CPS headquarters with their EDI team and in CPS areas of the 10 involved in the case review study on the results of our research and of the thematic reviews I conducted for the CPS. Would you be able to help the Chair understand a little bit more about that work?
Yes, sure. So, as this suggests, there were 15,000 cases, 15,000 files to be researched.
Was it 15,000 or 1,500?
1,500 in each of 10 CPS areas.
I see.
So 15,000 altogether.
Thank you.
And I pulled together a team of people, researchers, to assist me in this work. And it was interesting. England and Wales, to see how prosecutors functioned in those 10 CPS areas. And it wouldn't surprise you to hear that in many cases, the CPS area in which this plea bargaining practice was most evident were ones in rural or semi-urban settings. And the degree of harassment that, for example, owners of sub-post offices, South Asian, or corner shops experienced was just appalling. And some of those were repeated offenses, which made the practice of dropping the aggravated, racially aggravated or religiously aggravated element of these charges particularly concerning, because what it meant was that people were finding it easy, in a sense, to target black shop owners or whoever, and were less concerned about charges of criminal damage than racially aggravated criminal damage, for example. There were other issues around, because we were looking at race, we were also looking at gender. And the gender issues were different in a number of respects, particularly in terms of the prosecution of women for shoplifting or benefit fraud or whatever else it may be. But what stood out most, I think, was this issue of racially aggravated offenses and how they were being dealt with. The law, the act, was a few years earlier, 1998. And so it was an important time for that work to be done. And it is good that Peter Goldsmith intervened as soon as I brought the matter to his attention and issued guidance to CPS prosecutors across the England and Wales to ensure that that practice was discontinued.
And you looked at all of these cases and prepared a report in relation to that at the time?
Yes, and the report, as I said, was called Race for Justice.
Thank you. Now, I don't want to go into this document. Can I just ask you to look at something for the WIT 00134? Now, I know you referred to your CV in your statement. That was an earlier version. Am I right in saying this is the up-to-date version that the chair should have regard to in due course? And we can see that you've made references within this document to some up-to-date evidence that you gave in a recent criminal trial in England this year, and a number of other matters from this year and last year. So it's this version of the CV that should be considered. Thank you. And then I'd like to move on to paragraph 13 of your inquiry statement, please. And I think if we see the heading, just if we can come down the page slightly, or there we are, training, identifying the purpose of training. And it's at this section of your statement that you start to move on specifically to look at training. And you say here, paragraph 13, there's a danger that training as an activity becomes a kind of panacea. The go-to, or rather default position that many institutions adopt is, well, let's organise a training programme on this. Training is a facilitative process. It's meant to support people in doing better what they should be doing anyway. And quite often supporting them in doing better requires being very clear from the beginning as to what they should be doing anyway. And then you go on at paragraph 192. If we can slip to that, which I think is about 72, page 72, and at the bottom of the page, and you say training is not an activity that is done for its own sake. However much those who are required to do it might consider it a waste of money, time and energy. It is typically meant to facilitate self-development, self-awareness, awareness of organisational goals, and the development of knowledge. And then we can move on, understanding and skills, so that the workforce is better able to meet organisational objectives and give of their best because the working environment is conducive to their doing so. The working environment is not given, it is created by those who inhabit it, and therefore they are accountable to one another. Ideally, the working environment would be a reflection of the vision and that leaders and managers have for the organisation and its societal purpose. And the nature of that environment is created in large measure by the leadership of the organisation, the values they bring to it, and the extent to which they exemplify living those values. And I think here you address some of the comments you've made earlier today about the attitude of those being trained and the way they approach training generally. You talk here about self-development, self-awareness, and again you've touched on that already this morning. And you talk about awareness of organisational goals and the development of knowledge. And then talking about the working environment being conducive to doing and achieving all of these things, and that leadership in the organisation is important. And is that really reflective of what you've been telling us about this morning in your evidence?
Yes, it is. I think we pay too little attention to organizational cultures. How they are generated, how they are sustained, and I suppose the most difficult of all is how they get changed. And I can't stress enough, leadership is key to all of that, it seems to me. It's important that leaders inform themselves and satisfy themselves as to what the culture of the organization is. And the evidence of that is manifold. I mean, it comes from a scrutiny, an awareness and interrogation of a whole number of things. And above all, it is important that organizations are aware of what they do not know, what they are taking for granted. And when events such as a death after contact with the police take place, and one begins to look under the stones, organizations are suddenly alert to what they did not know or what they took for granted. And I think it is quite important that there is an understanding that mechanistic and performative stuff is not enough, especially if you're running an outward-facing, public-facing organization where people have quite legitimate expectations of you, what you would deliver, how you and your staff would behave, because it goes to the fundamental issue of people's civic entitlements and rights. And I don't believe that, especially within public bodies, we pay enough attention to that. And it goes back to what I was saying earlier about leadership and the quality of leadership. Because it's fundamental that we understand what the societal purpose of our organization is, and what we lead society to expect, what society has a right to expect.
And I think you go on to expand on this in your statement in paragraphs 15 and 16. So if we could perhaps move on to 15 first of all. That's page 6. And here you keep going. Yes, here you say the organisation needs, first of all, to determine which of its various functions has relevance for race equality or combating racism. And once a decision is made that these many functions do have relevance, then the question is, how does one identify within those functions what your race equality or combating racism objectives should be, and what form would that take, and what actions are necessary to enable you to meet those objectives. So looking at, first of all, an organisation, whichever organisation is being looked at, should determine which of its various functions has relevance for race equality or combating racism. And then you go on at paragraph 16 to say that a function is everything the organisation does in discharging its duties as a public body, and for a provider of services to its community and to society generally. And you give a number of examples from A down to M of examples of functions which may have a bearing in relation to this. And just to pick a few of those: appointing staff, supervising staff, conducting staff appraisals and performance reviews, formulating policies and putting in place procedures for registering and hearing complaints, grievances and disciplinary cases. So again, from what you've been saying earlier today, it's not simply about saying, let's have a training course.
Sure.
This has to look at all the functions of the organisation. And that goes from the very beginning of appointing staff who are probationers or trainees or new recruits who come in. From that very point, you have to look at every element and not just consider the training course, but beyond that, when they come out.
Yes.
Look at issues of complaints, look at staff appraisal, look at performance, look at the impact the training's had on them. So all of those aspects need to be reviewed if there's going to be a change. Is that fair to say?
Yes. And doing so in a manner that reinforces in people the understanding that they have permission to ask those kinds of questions. These organizations, uniformed organizations like the police and the army, etc., are pretty hierarchical. And there are all sorts of power relationships involved in people's interactions with one another. So the culture of the place must be such that individuals do find it easy, and I would use the word easy, to raise concerns, to talk about their anxieties about what they know or don't know, to seek advice, to even say to their managers that they do not think that they're being particularly helpful to them because of their own ingrained and entrenched attitudes. Difficult to do, but I mean, we may get on eventually to the concept of reverse mentoring and all of that stuff.
Yes.
But it's necessary to be able to do that. And within these hierarchical organizations, where rank is key, it's important that individuals are able to feel that their development means something, and what they are seeking to do in terms of raising issues, getting help, getting advice is seen as important, and important enough for the supervisors to allocate time to.
So achieving a cultural change, particularly in a hierarchical organisation, that has to start with an organisation where people can raise issues and ask questions, seek advice and guidance without fear.
Without
Fear of prejudicing their careers or other aspects of their personal life or professional life.
Indeed.
And then if we look at paragraph 17, you say once it is identified that a function needs to improve to achieve a race equality objective, to make sure that people do what is required and bring about the intended change, they may need training. So they're very clear as to what is required of them and how it fits into the strategic priorities of the organisation. In this way, you're able to identify concretely the actions that are being taken in relation to the function, what the results or impact of those actions are, how is it assisting you to get to where you want to be, and if it isn't, why it isn't, and what corrective measures you might want to take. If it is, and there are signs of good practice, how does one capture that? And if appropriate, spread it out across the organisation as good practice. Could you help the Chair understand a little more about that paragraph?
Yes.
I think in fairness, at paragraph 18 below, you were able to give us an example of an organisation identifying a function with relevance to race and designing or commissioning training to improve the operation of that function. And it was an example from Salford University.
Yes. I mean, it seems to me that there needs to be an emphasis placed on organizational learning, how that is done, where it comes from, and who is responsible both for capturing it and for disseminating it across the organization. Events occur. They're dealt with sometimes marvelously, sometimes badly. Whether they were particularly instructive and marvelous, or they were disastrous, it is important that the organization understands why. What made them successful? Why was the matter so badly handled? And act upon that. So I have been interested for some while in what actually happens in organizations when, for example, someone feels the need to take a complaint to the employment tribunal. And the tribunal might find that the person in the organization complained against has done wrong. They might determine that the complainant was discriminated against in terms of direct discrimination or whatever. One very rarely sees evidence of what then happens in the organization, apart from paying out whatever damages the bench might decide should be made in recompense for the wrong that was done to whoever it is. But quite often, those same managers continue if they don't get promoted. And they're still part of the organization and the way it has always worked. You don't, and I mean, okay, so I've been in universities for God knows how many years, right? And in some cases, as comparatively recently, I was responsible for assisting the vice chancellor with the strategic management of the organization. But even in those situations, somebody would complain to the employment tribunal, there would be a decision, the decision would be adverse as far as the organization is concerned. But there is no scrutiny thereafter as to what went wrong, why was that individual manager operating in that manner, and why was that matter not rectified before the complainant had cause to take it externally to the employment tribunal? What are we then going to do with that knowledge and ensure that we fix up, we don't continue with the situation? That kind of institutional learning very, very rarely takes place. And so the aggrieved person is sometimes, okay, they welcome the fact that they have the financial compensation and what have you. They may have lost their jobs. But what is particularly hurtful to them is the fact that in spite of all of that, and in spite of paying out all this amount of money, the organization allows that individual who was found to have discriminated to continue pretty much with business as usual. Which is why in another arena, I have recommended that as far as race is concerned, and given how difficult it is to root that out of organizations and systems, the Parliament should seriously consider putting in place a race relations register similar to the sex discrimination register. So if a tribunal finds you to have discriminated against somebody and is making recompense and suggesting that you pay 400,000, whatever amount of money it is, to people, you can't simply walk back into your job or leave that job and be re-employed to do something else. You should know that if you do those things and you don't take responsibility, you're going to be put on a race discrimination register as if you were a sex offender on a sex offenders register. We got to get serious about this matter. I've been dealing with that kind of stuff since 1964, for God's sake. And over and over again, I used to be a lay advocate in the employment tribunal. Over and over again, you see people being called out by employment tribunals and then continuing with their jobs. They've learned nothing, they care even less, and meanwhile, the careers of those whom they have discriminated against are in ruin. So I mean, that might not be the business of this inquiry, but I am saying that if we're talking about leadership and management and organizations taking responsibility for racial discrimination and combating racism, something serious needs to happen. And in my book, such a register is overdue.
And taking on board what you've just said, Professor, we have heard evidence in this inquiry about the presence or existence or absence of debriefing, it's called, both in Police Scotland and, or as they are now, and perk, where perhaps there was an absence of a debrief, where they did reflect on learning, and perhaps lessons were not identified and not learned. And is that one of the concerns that you have, if those things are not followed through? After?
Indeed. I mean, it's a prime responsibility, it seems to me.
I'm about to now move on to a separate section, which is at paragraph 20, training, evaluation and monitoring, but I'm conscious of the time. Could you give me a moment, please? Would this be an appropriate time to conclude?
We'll take a 20-minute break at this point.
Thank you.
Ms. Clare.
Thank you. We've already touched on this this morning, Professor, about the need for evaluation and monitoring after training is carried out. And you've told us your views on that. I wonder if I could ask you what you think about a statement that has been made available to the chair from a woman called Wendy Williams, and it's SBPI 0699. And to give you some of her background, I think you're aware of Wendy Williams. She's written and signed an inquiry statement that she's sent into the chair. She's a qualified solicitor. She was a prosecutor down for the CPS. She was one of His Majesty's Inspectors of Constabulary and the Fire and Rescue Service down south. And she was responsible for inspecting 13 of the 43 police forces in England and Wales, as well as carrying out joint and national thematic inspections of all forces into areas including race and policing in 2023. And she has given us this statement, and at paragraph 3 confirms that she is the author of an HMIC FRS report, Disproportionate Use of Police Powers, a Spotlight on Stop and Search and Use of Force. And she wrote that, authored that. I'd like to look at paragraph 6 of her statement, which we can see coming up on the screen. And it says, the 2021 report contains a section explaining why diversity training is not enough on its own, and what, in your view, is the most effective approach to implementing training on race in policing. I'm going to read out a section of this to you, and then I'll ask you to comment and see whether you agree with what she's said. So it starts on line 3, forces with better overall outcomes. Do you see that? Line 3 at the end?
Yes.
Forces with better overall outcomes tend to approach training from the perspective of improving professional practice. The quality of training, including hearing from members of the public of their experience of the use of police powers and the positive or negative effects, and techniques for avoiding or defusing conflict, or providing supervisors with the necessary tools to manage performance effectively, are examples. Some forces focus more on quantitative rather than qualitative measures to demonstrate that the workforce was fully trained. Often the content of the training failed to address all the issues relevant to the use of police powers, and in some forces, officers and staff received no refresher training, the assumption being that having received training once, they are now equipped to deal with a wide range of scenarios. She says the report makes clear that incidents can escalate quickly, and officers and staff may have to make split-second judgments, which can have positive or negative consequences. Police forces should therefore promote continuing professional development for officers and staff. Now, before the break, you mentioned sheep dipping, and I see in your statement you say, if people are put through the trough, you know they're done for the year. I think that's how you describe sheep dipping in your statement. And you say, they get on with business and they come back again next year for something equally unsophisticated. And we see here that Wendy Williams is talking about some forces focus on quantity rather than quality. And I just wondered, having looked at that inquiry statement from Wendy Williams, whether you would agree with what she's saying here about the approach taken by some forces and how that's really inadequate.
I think this resonates pretty much with what I was sharing before the break. I agree wholeheartedly with what she's saying in her report. The when I said earlier about the lack of institutional learning or organizational learning, I'm really pointing to what I think our organizational culture matters. And again, it relates to what I was saying earlier about the extent to which individuals feel they can raise issues, have the confidence to do that, knowing that they won't be either victimized or, for that matter, thought of as troublemakers or whatever else it may be. And this, and what I was sharing earlier, I see as a much more holistic approach to training, and to evaluating, if you like, the impact of training on organizational efficiency as well as on officer competence. Those things can't be separated off into different boxes. And I think the more we concentrate on the integrated nature of these particular elements of training and organizational development, is the better people would actually experience training generally, and maybe, well, not maybe, hopefully, have a less jaundiced approach to it, and its consequences for them.
Do you think that you've seen examples in your professional career where police forces have perhaps focused too much on practical skills, officer competence and skills such as Wendy Williams is speaking about, de-escalation, restraint, matters of that sort?
I mean, those things are those things are clearly very important. What I think people need to bear in mind is how different communities or different parts of the same community have actually experienced police doing those things in the same division, let's say. People could experience the police having a totally different attitude to some young people engaging in antisocial behavior, let's say, on the street. Their attitude towards de-escalation, towards getting people to stop acting stupidly, might be very different for the way they approach a group of white teenagers, for example, as distinct from the way they would approach a group of black teenagers. And there were expectations set up on both sides. In that I mean, by virtue of their own experience as young people, certain young people in groups or even on their own might have particular attitudes to a group of police officers coming towards them, which might not be the same for a group of white young people. So it's a matter of understanding, particularly the police understanding all of that, and therefore understanding why it is that they need to be sensitive in their approach to people who would have had all of that as their experience of the police. And it is in that sense, people take personal responsibility in their operational roles for how the police are seen.
Can I move on to something else that you've raised in this section in your statement, paragraph 24? So if we can go back to your inquiry statement, please. And you've said all three organisations, Police Scotland, PERC and Crown Office, have resource constraints. Irrespective of those, however, they have a responsibility to ensure continuous professional development. This is necessary for upholding sound professional standards and for assisting all staff in embracing personal responsibility for their own self-development and for using their agency in building a culture of equity and in eliminating discrimination and the toxicity of racism, Islamophobia, misogyny, homophobia and more. Now, I think in your statement, you then go on at paragraph 25 to comment on an example of an institution providing effective training despite budgetary constraints, and you specifically mentioned Coventry University. Could you tell the Chair a little more about this, please?
Yes. Over the last many years, well, let's see, the last 5 years or so, there has been within the higher education sector a focus on decolonizing curriculum. And at Coventry University, I was asked by the Vice Chancellor to lead on this particular issue. Things became a trifle interesting when I suggested that you couldn't sensibly decolonize curriculum without decolonizing the institution. By that I mean institutional practices, institutional cultures, institutional approaches to knowledge and how knowledge is produced and how it is validated and whose knowledge is considered to be more valuable than others. All of that has an impact on how you approach decolonization and how that translates in terms of what individual lecturers do, the material they use, the assessment procedures they use, and so on. So it has to be seen as an integrated process in that sense. Not a lot of money was dedicated, if any, was dedicated to the decolonizing project at Coventry University. But there were individual members of staff who were very committed and wanted to share their own approaches to decolonizing curriculum. So we organized as a staff group amongst ourselves a number of online seminars, meetings that we had internally to talk about the issues, the academic issues, the delivery issues, the epistemological issues involved in the whole process of decolonizing curriculum. And the Black Staff Network played a lead in that, a very effective lead. And it was quite important that they performed the kind of coordinating function, bringing members of staff together, teaching staff, or even heads of school, and so on, but also students, because the Students' Union had a number of course representatives, and those student reps would be commenting on courses and the delivery and the dynamics within courses and so on. So we were able to bring all of that together and look in a rounded sort of way at what the contribution of each of those elements would be to decolonizing curriculum, and how from within our own work we could package this and give guidance to other people across the university as to how to do it in their own areas or their own disciplines.
So garnering the enthusiasm of students, student networks, student organisations and the Black Staff Network.
Yes.
Rather than taking individual members of staff away and paying them to do particular pieces of work, but actually building on, could I say, a groundswell of enthusiasm from other organisations.
Yes, I mean, there's a difference in my view between, for example, organizing a conference that brings together academics from different institutions across the land who want to look theoretically at what decolonizing the curriculum should mean. There's a lot of value in that. And one might be able to feed into that forum the sorts of things that I'm just talking about. But in terms of the institution itself and how each person with a teaching responsibility or as an academic personal tutor engages with this agenda, it's particularly important to look concretely at what people are doing routinely in their jobs and how that has an impact on the way they might approach decolonizing the curriculum. It is like what we were saying before the break. How does one, within this particular function, identify X, Y, Z, and what you're going to do about it?
Now, we've heard evidence that there is some concern has been expressed that individuals who are particularly enthusiastic about something such as racism or discrimination can ultimately find that they are given quite a heavy burden, which is not being remunerated, they're not being paid for that, and that burden can be quite a heavy one over a long period of time. Did you have any concerns about that with Coventry, or did you address it in some way?
Well, I personally was constantly addressing it because I have been aware, not just within that institution, but generally, about a practice which I have called blaxploitation. I spelled BLAX-ploitation. And by this I mean where black members of staff, especially as you've described, they have their normal job description that they're working to. But by virtue of their own enthusiasm and commitment to bringing about change within the organization, they volunteer to do whatever it is, whether within the Black Staff Network or the Women's Staff Network focusing on black women or whatever. The organization then comes to expect that from them, not just passively, but it would actually make demands. So that person would be invited to sit on this working group about X or Y, attend this meeting with the senior leadership team, engage with the students' union or student support services or whatever. And they're doing all of that not as their paid job, but because they bring a knowledge and understanding from the life experience, including the attempts that they made in their former employment to get change on these particular issues. They're not remunerated, nor are they given remission from other duties in order to enable them to do that sort of thing. So they find themselves working until all kinds of hours of the night to do what is required on top of their main job. And what is even worse is that when the institution then determines that really this is an area that needs dedicated staffing involvement, and they determined that they would recruit to a post that they create. Quite often, they recruit externally and get somebody in whom they believe have got the credentials to satisfy their job specification. Meanwhile, the person who's been doing all that sort of stuff for any length of time is sometimes not even shortlisted for the post being advertised. Now, that's a particularly egregious form of blaxploitation.
And when you were working with Coventry University in this area, were there any steps that you took to avoid blaxploitation?
There were, there are certain confidences which clearly I can't share here, but there were, in the sense that the senior leadership team was made aware that there was need for a post in that particular area, that they needed to identify and agree a strategic role for the Black Staff Network. The Black Staff Network should be able to contribute to the strategic management of the organization. And I discussed that separately in another part of my statement. In other words, it's not enough to give people 2,000 pounds for a Black History Month event or whatever, or to have a welcome event for new members of staff joining the organization whom you want to invite to join the Black Staff Network. Unless people can see that there is some point in them joining the network, and that isn't just an opportunity to moan and get things off your chest, then they are unlikely, however much they love you, they're unlikely to want to give their precious time to coming and sitting and building the Black Staff Network, because it then becomes, your own little support club, as distinct from having any impact whatsoever on the way the organization does its business or learns from your experience.
So in terms of recognizing that this could be a potential problem, do you consider that the leadership being aware of that and taking cognizance of it is sufficient to avoid blaxploitation? Or do you think there are other practical steps that perhaps could be taken from the very beginning that would help minimize that risk?
Okay, two things about that. Organizations must have an approach to staff development and to staff diversification, which results in them investing in the staff that they've already got. Equal opportunity employment is not just about making sure that people wanting to come in could do so uninhibited by whatever barriers might be in the way. It's also about nurturing the people you already have developing them so that they could become part of the pool from which you recruit. And I can't stress that enough, because I've been in too many situations where individuals come with their experience. They're able to, they have a presence within the place. Whenever there's something likely to kick off in one particular area or amongst one group of staff, they are the people who will be called upon to intervene and go and sort matters out. It happens a lot in schools. You may not be the pastoral head. You could be a head of a year group down the corridor, but because you are Ms. So-and-so or Mr. So-and-so, and you've developed that relationship with black kids and with white kids, and indeed with their parents, you're seen as the person who could be the firefighter and intervene and sort things out. Nobody would think in terms of developing you in that role, ensuring that you have the opportunities to shadow somebody, for example, as a pastoral head or whatever. And when you want to fill a post, you've done a restructure, you believe that given the rate at which we're growing or the changing ethnicity of our school role, we need to have somebody in post. You then go and you recruit externally, whereas you can build upon the knowledge and experience and understanding of your own dynamics, never mind anything else, that these individuals who've been doing this thing voluntarily for so long actually have. And bring them up to a point where they can be recruited to deputy head or whatever, pro vice chancellor, whatever the position might be. And it is in that sense that people get taken for granted. Their passion for seeing justice done, because they're black, because they've suffered that stuff, because they're concerned about outcomes for black children, all of that is sort of taken as given. And it is as if they have a responsibility to act in those ways, to deliver those services, to build those relationships, because they're black. I've been in that position myself pretty often, except that I have very little tolerance for it, and I tell people where to go.
But there could be opportunities within any organisation, if I'm right in understanding your answer, to identify people who have demonstrated that they have particular skills or talents in an area. And from identifying those people, you could tap into their enthusiasm, their work ethic. There could be perhaps a job created which they would be suitable for. They could be promoted to a role which allows them to share that experience and those skills. But really it would be about identifying those people in an organisation who've already demonstrated that they have some talent and may be a good option, rather than turning a blind eye to that and looking elsewhere for a set of qualifications.
Yes, and it is, as you can imagine, it's also a moral question. A moral not just for the individual who's passed over in that sense, but for others like them within the organization. It's a mark that the organization does not value you sufficiently to want to invest in you in those ways. And it becomes particularly unacceptable when you look around at who the senior leadership team is and how bereft they are in terms of their understanding of those kinds of issues.
Thank you. Can I move on to something else that you've touched on today, dealing with prejudices? and people in your organisation who have prejudices and aren't afraid perhaps to express them. And you've talked about, and in your statement at paragraph 31, you talk about people can be given licence to indulge their prejudices. You mentioned that in relation to the training that you observed after the Macpherson
Yes.
inquiry. And we've heard evidence about people's attitudes to training generally. We've heard evidence in this inquiry from a Sandra DeLonde Clark. And I think at one point you were asked to comment on some evidence that she gave.
Sure.
Now, this won't come up on the screen. I'm reading short from a transcript of her evidence. But we asked her about the conduct of people within an organisation which is perhaps driven by stereotypes. And people acting out on their stereotypes that they have. And she said, if Police Scotland give officers, in particular response officers and leaders who make policies and decisions, if we give them training and we give them those skills and that knowledge to understand that their reactions may be based on their stereotypes, we'll never ever get there. And that's why I keep talking about unconscious bias training or implicit bias. If we're not aware of it, we simply go on doing what we've always done before. And so I think the role of Police Scotland can play in making people aware of these biases that we have, we're born with, we live in a developed first world country. You're exposed to television, people begging, minority ethnic people, and you have those little stereotypes in your head and they will never go away. I think it's a responsibility of the service to educate people about that, to give them time to sit down and process those thoughts, and to give them the tools to identify when they're doing it, give them the tools to address it. And that's the role they can play, because it's involved in almost every interaction that you have with the public. And the chair asked Miss DeLonde Clark, if having done all that, so if having delivered the training, and if having made people aware of their biases and the stereotypes they're relying on, if that conduct persists, how do you deal with that? And she said, well, they call me affectionately, sack them, Sandra. I am thinking that maybe the police service isn't for you. There are some people who are too focused, there are some people who are untrainable, in other words, and lack the necessary understanding of why the police is so important. The office of constable is so important. So there are some people who I think are just not fit for certain roles. And I know that may sound harsh, but in reality, it's for every job. And there are people who are not best suited for it. And I think in the 21st century of policing, there are a set of values and a set of characteristics that are necessary to do that job. Now, do you have any thoughts or comments about that evidence that we heard from Miss DeLonde Clark? Do you agree with her?
I'll endorse it 100%. I mean, I thought her evidence was particularly useful to the inquiry. Overall, I've talked a lot in my statement and indeed in my remarks so far today about taking personal responsibility. And I want to broaden that out in the context of how organizations ensure that they are respecting the rights of individuals who work for them or whom they are in business to serve in communities. And you will know that throughout my statement, I make repeated reference to the relationship between equality legislation, equality and human rights legislation, and organizational culture. My professional position on that is, and has always been, that organizations should have as the primary objective building a culture of equity, so that anybody, whatever their profile, could expect to experience the organization as equitable. But then organizations operate within society where there are all kinds of divisions and discriminations on the axis of race or gender or class or whatever else it might be. And people come into those organizations with all kinds of dispositions. I mentioned earlier the BBC Secret Policeman documentary, for example. What the law does is to assist the organization in ensuring that it can deliver the rights and entitlements of everybody by requiring each person who works for the organization to understand that it is through what they do and how they do it that is done. It means, therefore, that individuals have got to understand that irrespective of their disposition, you might not like me as a black person. You might not like black people. You might not like women with children. You might not like women who are of an age where they are still childbearing. But that does not empower you to discriminate against them, because your interest is in not having your employment or your services disturbed by people going on maternity leave. So the organization constrains individuals to operate in a certain manner. And if you feel that you can't abandon your prejudices, or you believe that all of this EDI stuff is a whole heap of hogwash, then it means that you have no right to be in the organization. So Sakem Sandra is absolutely right. You just sack them. You make it clear that whatever other qualities and skills you have, my friend, you cannot continue to operate within this organization if you refuse to accept responsibility for respecting other people's rights and not discriminating against them. Pure and simple.
And that would apply equally, not just to the police service, but also to anyone in an organisation such as PERC or the Crown Office.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Can we move on now to look at modes and frequency of training? Paragraphs 34 to 47 of your inquiry statement. So here you've discussed modes and frequency. I'd like to begin with paragraph 37, if I may, primarily A. And you talk here about certain modes of training, and the first one you mention here is scenario-based training. involving exploration of race as a factor in the way the event unfolds and is dealt with, including by first responders, body-worn cameras, CCTV footage. These are a good source of material to be examined in such training. Now, the Chair has heard a number of witnesses talk about scenario-based training and the benefits of that. We heard evidence, in fact, last week from a Martin Graves, who is an officer safety training expert and has been involved in training in relation to the practical aspects of training. And he spoke about the benefits of this method of delivery of training compared to other ways of delivering training. And he spoke about the scenario-based training could increase realism. He said it can maintain safety within that heightened realism scenario. He talked about it allows a degree of resistance from a subject to be demonstrated and practiced. He said it can sometimes trigger an officer's response, and that could then be talked through and discussed in that safe training environment. But it was a much more realistic type of training, which can then be applied by the officer when he goes out on operational duties. Is that the type of thing that you could see working with the training you're talking about? Race, discrimination, equality and diversity? Things that incorporated into scenario-based training?
Yes, it is what I'm talking about. A great deal, of course, depends upon the skill or skills and knowledge of the trainer. Because it's an interactive process, obviously. And that means that different individuals might derive different meanings from what they're seeing, or might want to relate what they're seeing in the scenario-based training to events in their own experience. On such and such a day, 2 months ago, I, on duty, witnessed this, or I was called upon to do that, or whatever. And so there's always an interaction where people are relating their past experience to what it is that they're being taught. Sometimes it assists them in understanding better what was happening in that experience. Sometimes it might raise questions about what is being suggested to them, because as far as they're concerned, what is being suggested to them does not allow for the nuances in the situation that they were a part of. So this is why I'm saying it depends very much on the skill, the competence, the knowledge of the individual trainer. It's a facilitative process.
Martin Graves gave evidence last week on day 118 of the inquiry, and he said they're designed to implement the behavioural changes in an officer or a pair of officers when dealing with set situations. It's very easy to sort of teach somebody a new skill. When you ask them to then apply that skill in an operational context, lots of things can go awry and go wrong. So the idea of simulated scenarios or testing them under a degree of pressure to get their heart rate increased, to get them to be able to respond correctly during times of stress and conflict is a valid tool to be able to test that behavioural side. And it also tests things like their communication skills, their ability to manage conflict and use the correct type of tactics and terminology. And it's then a good tool afterwards for them to be able to explain and brief the trainers in relation to their decision-making process. So there's an awful lot that can come out of scenario-based events, not least of all that pressure testing of their skill and ability to talk to people and their ability to use de-escalation tools to resolve that situation. And do you agree with Mr.
I would
Brady?
agree with all of that.
And do you think that training about discrimination and discriminatory attitudes could perhaps be flushed out or discussed and approached as part of scenario-based training?
Yes. Again, it depends very much on what scenarios are thought to be useful and relevant in that situation, and what the trainer want the outcomes of that to be. One of the reasons why I stress the issue of the skill and understanding of trainers is that those situations are complex and they're dynamic and they're operating within a context where certainly within organizations such as the police, they're not routine conversations. And we all know that race engenders all kinds of anxieties in people. They don't like to talk about it. Many people are uncomfortable talking about race. Many people don't have the language with which to talk about race and racial discrimination and what have you. So all of that has got to be taken into consideration when one is going to deal with stuff like that. Some individuals might have some very real anxieties, but are petrified at saying the wrong things or calling people by the wrong names or whatever else it may be. And if they stay with that and it's not expressed, it's not externalized, they might leave the training in even more confusion than when they came. So it's very important that the trainer has the capacity to put people at ease, make sure that they're operating within a safe space, and people can be confident that they won't be considered stupid, they won't be considered racist, bigoted, or ignorant, or whatever else it may be, but that they genuinely want to equip themselves with the knowledge, the skills, the understanding in order to do better what it is that they're employed to do.
And so if we're looking at training that would help make people comfortable in a secure environment, to make them comfortable talking about race without judgment, it makes them more able to learn and to absorb that training.
Yes.
And do you think scenario-based training in that training environment could be of benefit to people to make them more comfortable and make them more able to learn about these issues?
But it will never be a quick fix.
No.
It is a method which can't be considered to be sufficient in itself, and it's got to be part of a whole battery of other stuff, some of which we've talked about before today.
It shouldn't just be the training aspect. It shouldn't be seen in isolation. There's a wider context here.
And when those people leave that training and go about their daily business, other things would emerge, and they will be able to reflect upon it. They might want to apply that training to new situations that they find themselves in. And they need to have an opportunity to do that. That's what I talked about when I talked about training being, if you like, building blocks of a much bigger, more rounded edifice, so to speak.
And you also, in your statement, talk about other types of training and the impact that can have. And one of them is at 37B. See the start of it. I'd like to move on to that. Hearing stories of people's lived experience, including police officers' accounts of what they did in certain situations, how that was viewed by onlookers, and by their colleagues, and what they learnt from it, and what they would do differently. So I think you're talking not just about lived experience from officers or members of the public who've had poor experiences, but also from officers who've handled things, perhaps officers who've handled things well. That could
Yes.
be part of the lived experience training. We have heard some evidence in the inquiry about training which has been conducted within Police Scotland about lived experience. And we heard from a Conrad Trickett some time ago, days 45 and 46 of the inquiry. And Conrad Trickett talked about his personal experience when he was, I believe, doing post-incident management training, and he talked about doing learning from hearing from someone who had lived experience. And I think he said it was a particularly powerful way of absorbing and truly comprehending the impact of that. We've also heard from Fiona Taylor, former designated Deputy Chief Constable. And she talked about her involvement with the Independent Review Group, who are associated with Police Scotland, and her own experience of hearing from people who have lived experience. And she described being, and the word she used was shocked about the situations that she was hearing about and learning about, and talked in some detail, and this about the impact that that had on her personally in relation to lived experience. Now, that's just two examples that I'm giving you of officers who have said that it was very powerful evidence they heard. Do you have any thoughts about perhaps the experience of lived experience training being rolled out on a broader, wider scale and the benefit of that? Or do you think that sharing that with leaders in the service is sufficient?
It's difficult. It's difficult to answer this because there are so many "it depends."
All right.
For one thing, there are all kinds of nuances. You and I might have the same experience, well, right, put it another way. We might both witness an event and have a completely different experience of it. We might want to talk about it, although we both were part of it in different ways. And that for a whole number of reasons. Hopefully we would agree, if we're talking about an incident involving a couple of individuals, that yes, that person was wearing white trousers rather than pink, or those kinds of details. But in terms of how the actions of the individual were experienced and understood by myself, that would depend upon a whole number of things to do with my own prior experiences, the stereotypes I have, the tropes that I might be walking around with, or the degree of sensitivity I have to the individual, whether it be in terms of their being motivated by fear or stress or whatever else it may be. And in situations of encounters between the police and the public, that becomes a big deal. So it's not easy to talk about those things in not even absolute terms, in even relative terms, because the number of nuances are huge, and part of the process, therefore, of the training using that kind of method is to be able to point to the fact that there are many nuances, identify them, and begin to address them. So it depends on whether the objectives of the training lend themselves to that particular method. It may be valuable, productive, or it may not be. So you've got to ask all of those questions. What are the intended outcomes? What do you want people to learn? What do you want them to bring to the engagement and the learning exercise? How does that relate to the roles that they would perform or perform on a day-to-day basis? And how does it assist them in performing those roles more competently and more sensitively or whatever? So the planning of the training and therefore determining the methods that are most appropriate is a key part of the whole process.
So it's not as simple as saying, we've got a quick fix here, we're going to have a session where someone has lived experience and they will share that with a large number of staff. That is not what you're envisaging when you're talking about rolling out training that is going to fit in with the organisation and be focused on the goals and the functions of the organisation, and then be used by people and make a difference to their behaviour when they leave the training room.
But again, as I said, it depends. I can see a situation where, for example, if you had traffic officers talking about a pileup on a motorway or a dual carriageway or whatever, and scenarios arising from that, it can be very useful for others to get an understanding of the whole gamut of stuff that's involved there, and how officers acting in a fast-moving situation deal with those things, whether it be in terms of people being deceased and having pets in the car or whatever, or having to work with the first responders, paramedics, fire service, or whatever. And so you can talk about a whole number of things, dealing with the relationship aspects of them as distinct from how do you make sure that you record XYZ on a form about the particular elements of the incident. And that could be very, very valuable. But again, it depends very largely on what it is that one wants to portray, how you want to enable the individuals who were involved to use that opportunity to share their experiences and say what learning they derived, what they knew before then, what was totally new to them, how they had to operate in that new situation, and what it is that they would want to say to their colleagues, having been through that.
So this morning you talked about, for example, a white person born in Glenrothes or Cooper, brought up at school in that area with perhaps limited contact with black members of a community. Is there some merit in lived experience training or contact with people who have lived experience, perhaps assisting to fill a gap in the knowledge of staff, such as the one born in Glenrothes or Cooper?
There could be. I mean, even by people identifying what they did not know and how valuable it would have been to know it. Pretty simple things. Do you shake the hands of a Muslim woman? Do you shake the hands of a Jewish woman? And in terms of family liaison, which we may come on to, these kinds of things become quite important. What are the habits, learned habits that you've been socialized into, that you're bringing to a situation where cultural customs based either on religion or not are totally different to your own? How do you begin to ensure that you are sensitive to people's lives and the way they organize themselves domestically or generally? And these are real situations, and people have real experiences of those sorts of things, whether they get them right or wrong. So, and you must be able to discuss those kinds of things in a pretty matter-of-fact way, acknowledging, as I was suggesting earlier, that most of Scotland would be socialized into some cultural habits and expectations, etc., that are not commonly shared by the whole population. And not just on the axis of race or ethnicity, on the axis of class.
Yeah.
The experience and habits of lairds and crofters aren't necessarily the same.
Could you give me a moment, please? Thank you. I'm about to move on to another topic.
We'll stop for lunch and sit at 2 o'clock.